everybody, and welcome to Sidebar with me, JT, Brother Brewmeister. It's so nice to have you here. Thank you so much for being members, and you get the early access in 3 days. Everybody else will see it, but for you all, it's early. And so today we are going to be talking about false confessions and the Norfolk Four here on Sidebar. And so I feel like um, I've been doing this true crime thing for quite some time. And I guess it's one of the hobbies that is stuck. I've stuck with the most, I guess. But would I love for it to be full time? Absolutely. But that's not really the point. The point is, in my time covering true crime and true crime adjacent, I've seen some pretty gnarly things. And I don't mean gnarly in the sense of like a West Coast surfer riding gnarly waves. I mean, see the definition of my brother in the dictionary. But what I do mean is just the incredibly horrifying stories that come across the desk, whether it be in the form of trials for the live stream or the cases for the podcasts that I do. I think I think that a lot of people think that myself and co-hosts, including Brandy, uh, a lot of people tend to think that podcast slash live streamers, broadcast and then dump. That once we tell a story or we cover a case or a trial, that case is put away on the shelf and that we don't concern ourselves with it again. And the reality is that for me and many other live streamers and podcasters, we carry those cases for a long time after. And we do realize that those who are the victims, the victims' families and friends, well, while we carry it for longer, they have to live with the repercussions of these crimes and cases for life. And my point in all of this is that there's a lot that you know, we have come across that's horrifying. And sometimes I feel like this has to be, well, let me put it this way. Something that seems to be even more horrifying than a lot of it is a conviction based on false confession. That that absolutely seems to really bungle up the works. And so again, welcome to the 13th Juror Sidebar. I'm JT, talking about the Norfolk Four and false confessions. Now, for false confessions, not only are you embarrassed by being bought out and then sorry, not bought out, being brought out and then basically paraded about in front of media, even the smallest of cases, you're paraded in front of media. But, you are alienated from your family, your friends, and then some. And in addition, you're being portrayed as something you're not. Even if you prove your innocence beyond a shadow of a doubt, you will spend the rest of your life saying, "Yeah, but it wasn't me. No, no, really, it wasn't. Like, take a look, see what happened." So, those who have been falsely accused and those who were fooled into doing so through tactics that I'll explain in a bit begin to question even themselves. The psychological tactics and pressure placed on someone without the proof of guilt is disgusting. It's a ploy that's utilized inappropriately to secure a conviction. Why? Mostly to get arrest rates up. And, you know, their time a case is open, they want that down. Or to pad ego when an answer might not be as readily available as originally thought. Now, is this the case all the time? Absolutely not. I would be a moron to think that. But I also know the pressure placed on law enforcement from within. And that's not an excuse, that's a reality. So let's get into false confessions and the case of the Norfolk Four. The Norfolk Four sound a little bit like a gang. In fact, if I didn't know any better, and having lived close to Norfolk, Virginia for a while myself, where this all happened, this sounds like a crazy name for a gang in a movie starring the Rat Pack. The reality is much, much worse. So, four United States Navy veterans, Joseph J. Dick Jr., Derek Tice, Daniel Williams, and Eric C. Wilson, were wrongfully convicted in 1999 and 2000. These convictions were for the rape and murder of Michelle Moore-Bosko. Now, I mentioned earlier, Norfolk. So let me talk a little bit about it. The city of Norfolk is at worst a weird place at night and at best a hard city to pronounce unless you're from there. Those that weren't born in the area will pronounce it Norfolk. Those who are from the area pronounce it Norfolk. And those who just wanted to get one over on the middle school teacher pronounce it Norfolk. I wasn't one of them. Always. So Norfolk is the third most populous city in Virginia, and it's the 94th largest city in the nation, and it was incorporated in 1705. Although it's been inhabited way before then, of course. It was incorporated as one of the four cities in 1619 by Sir George Yeardley. It's surrounded by the Hampton Roads Natural Harbor, which connects everything to the Chesapeake Bay. On top of that, in Norfolk, there is Naval Station Norfolk. There's a huge naval presence. On top of Naval Station Norfolk, there is one of NATO's 2 strategic command headquarters there. And in addition, the Port of Virginia is located there as well. Now, for the purposes of this case, the population in Norfolk was somewhere between 234,400 and 261,200. So, some notable folks to come out of Norfolk. I myself was quite surprised. You got Steve Bannon. Well, Steve's not exactly notable, but I guess he's from there. Grant Gustin, who played Flash on CW. John Wesley Shipp, who plays the older Flash on CW. William McGee, who's the founder of Operation Smile. Wayne Newton. Scott Travis, the drummer for Judas Priest and Thin Lizzy. Patrick Wilson, actor and Tony Award winner. And, well, the Norfolk Four. So before we talk specifically about the Norfolk Four, I wanted to get into a little about false confessions. We all know by now, I can't just talk about cases. I like to give a little bit of context. You can't imagine how much is out there about false confessions, or maybe you can. This is a big problem. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, as most of you actually know a thing or two about crime. False confessions are basically admissions of guilt for a crime that someone did not commit. It sounds so basic. It sounds so easy to avoid, but it's not. And if, it's just not, or we wouldn't be talking about it. It's all counterintuitive. I mean, you didn't do something, but you still make a voluntary admission. Well, let's talk a little bit about false confession in general. There's a difference between false confessions and forced confessions. Forced confessions happen when there is the use of torture or threat or of physical harm. Now, I didn't see much regarding the threat of death penalty here, but my thoughts are, if it causes mental distress, and then that's a version of torture. If you're going to threaten the death penalty, causing mental distress, I see that somewhat as a psychological torture. Now, I don't know if that's how many see it. In my book, it is. So there are at least 3 big causes of false confessions. In an article called False Confessions, Causes, Consequences, and Implications, Dr. Richard Leo states these are misclassification, coercion, and contamination. Now, while there is no single cause, these 3 errors happen during the sequential events of interrogations. So, misclassification occurs when detectives simply decide that the person they have in custody, whether innocent or guilty, is just straight up guilty. Davis and Leo say, quote, "The path to false confession begins, as it must, when police target an innocent suspect. One specific suspect, once specific suspects are targeted, police interviews and interrogations are thereafter guided by the presumption of guilt. Coercion errors, on the other hand, occur after detectives determine an innocent person is guilty and then follow up with accusatory statements and interrogations. At this point, you can see the heavy weight a confession has in court, as the detectives might not have any evidence pointing to the innocent man, but the confession is so vital to get out of them, because other than that, they have nothing. Now, finally, the contamination error occurs after the initial false confession. After the confession is what is called the post-admission phase, where the story is told. They've, quote, got it off their chest, and now they just need to inform the detectives what happened. Quote, the detective's goal is to elicit a persuasive account that successfully incriminates the suspect and leads to his conviction. What I call that is a mess, like for real. In addition to errors, there are also three types of false confessions. Voluntary false confessions are, quote, thus explained by the internal psychological states or needs of the confessor, or by external pressure brought to bear on the confessor by someone other than the police. Most voluntary false confessions appear to result from an underlying psychological disturbance of like a psychiatric disorder. Compliant false confessions occur when someone confesses due to police coercion, stress, or pressure to either end the interrogation or take advantage of a deal, also known as, quote, we won't give you the death penalty if you confess. Finally, persuaded false confessions occur when police interrogation tactics cause an innocent suspect to doubt his memory, and he becomes temporarily persuaded that it is more likely than not that he committed the crime, despite having absolutely no memory of committing it. It's quite the occurrence, and boy, is it ever an occurrence. In 1992, the Innocence Project was founded in order to use new DNA evidence to dispute certain questionable convictions. At present, which is the 2014 article called False Confessions Causes, Consequences, and Implications for Reform by Saul Kassan, 30% of over 300 DNA exonerations have involved false confessions. Now, in the end, there are big issues with confessions in general, along with police interrogation tactics. Once, um, one of the most widely used techniques until recently was the Reed technique. So let's talk a little bit about this Reed technique. This was popular up until 2014, and even past that. It includes a non-step. It includes a 9-step process. Sorry, reading is hard. This is all from the OLR research report on interrogation techniques, which says that this interrogation technique, quote, should only occur when the investigator is reasonably certain of the suspect's involvement in the issue under investigation. I guess to that, my question is, what is reasonably? I mean, do you play with someone's life for a relative concept of what reasonably is? So, step 1, the positive confrontation. Tell the suspect the evidence shows they are guilty. Step 2, theme development. Present moral justification for the offense and do it in a sympathetic manner. As I get running through this, if you've seen any true crime documentaries that include interrogations, you're going to pick up on some of these things right off the bat. You'll just be like, oh, that. Step 3, handling denials. When a suspect asks for permission to speak at this stage, to deny accusations, discourage them from doing so. Step 4, overcoming objections. When denial doesn't succeed, the guilty will make objections to support innocence. Accept objections like they are truthful, and use objections to further develop the theme. Step 5, procurement and retention of suspect's attention. Get the suspect to focus on the investigator's theme rather than on the punishment. Close the physical distance between himself or herself and the suspect. You all have seen this in interrogations. You see the detective kind of sit up a little bit, pull between at the chair right under him and pull himself forward and get closer. We've seen it a lot. We see it all the time. Number 6, handling the suspect's passive mood. Intensify the presentation and concentrate on central reasons as justification. Display understanding and a sympathetic demeanor. Number 7, or step 7, presenting an alternative question. Investigator presents 2 choices while assuming guilt. Now, for instance, this looks like, did you plan this thing out or did it just happen spur of the moment? Follow the questions with supporting statements that encourage the suspect to choose the more understandable side. Now, you'll notice out of those 2 options, I didn't do it wasn't one of them. Having the suspect orally relate various details of the offense. That's step 8. After the suspect accepts the alternative, which is admitting guilt, respond with a statement of reinforcement acknowledging the admission. Obtain a brief oral review of the basic events before asking detailed questions. Step 9, converting an oral confession to a written confession, repeating Miranda warnings, avoiding leading questions, using the suspect's own language. But the question really is, what about the 8 steps before that? Why was that just considered for step 9? Leading interrogation tactic. The read technique was a leading interrogation tactic and it's led to countless confessions. The problem is that this technique has been found to lead to more false confessions than anything because the subjects provided less information. It remains one of the more confrontational methods. And it took until 2017 for someone to say it was no longer to be used because of its coercive methods. Now, has it actually been replaced? Well, that takes training and time and money, I guess. Now, there are a few more techniques. The read method is just the most messed up one, but also it's the most used one. I'm sure there are others that have been used that are violent and insane as well, but this one's the most used. Now, as an alternative to the read method, in England, they use the peace method. I just want to talk about one other method to let everyone know that all things police or law enforcement aren't entrapment. Sometimes it might seem like that with everything that we discuss. So the peace method, in peace, that stands for preparation and planning, engage and explain, account, closure, and evaluation. Now, listen, I'm not going to go into many details, but I will say that overall, this method allows a suspect to tell his or her story without interruption before presenting the suspect with any contradictions between story and evidence. The important part is that the investigators are not allowed to deceive suspects. Well, there is an edited book by Mark Kebbel and Graham Davies, and they write this. Social scientists, legal scholars, and independent researchers have aptly documented that contemporary methods of psychological interrogation can and sometimes do lead innocent individuals to confess falsely to serious crimes. The consequences of these false confessions can be disastrous for innocent individuals who are wrongly convicted and incarcerated. The consequences of false confession may be disastrous, even for those who were not convicted at trial. 2 recent studies have documented that when false confessors refuse to plead guilty and go to trial, conviction rates range from 73% to 81%. So, let's head on back to the Norfolk Four, shall we? On July 8th, 1997, a crime was committed that could only be described as disgusting, cruel, and wretched. A Navy sailor's wife was raped and murdered in their apartment home in Norfolk, Virginia. Billy Boston, a 19-year-old Navy sailor, returned home from an assignment he had, only to find Michelle Moore-Bosko, his 19-year-old wife, stabbed and strangled to death. The autopsy later confirmed that she had been raped as well. The couple were high school sweethearts and had married just 3 months before her murder. As mentioned above, the autopsy found that she died due to being stabbed and strangled. The stab wounds were described as being uniform in depth and clustered closely together. The medical examiner said these kinds of wounds happen with one assailant who stabbed someone multiple times. But there was an outside possibility of more than one person. Now, listen, here's the thing. If the wounds are uniform in depth and around the same location, wouldn't you, as just a human being, think it was probably the same person? It would be pretty tough for more than one person to get similar results like that. I mean, 2 people maybe. 4? Less than likely. There's definitely room there for reasonable doubt. Now, in addition to this report, they didn't find any evidence of a struggle inside the apartment, certainly not a large one, meaning that it's probable that Michelle knew her attacker. And here's Michelle Moore-Bosko and Billy Boston. So, of course, they don't have a lot to go on. Detectives are definitely looking for any possible leads. One of these detectives was Robert Glenn Ford, who at the time was around 43. Now, we're going to get more in depth with him a little bit later. Now, as anyone would do in an apartment complex, you canvass the location and nearby residences to see if anyone saw or heard anything, or if they knew the victim. Literally anything to give them some kind of lead. And unlike the detective in Travis Rudolph's case, the police interviewed a neighbor of Michelle's, Tamika Taylor. During that interview, Taylor revealed that another neighbor, Daniel Williams, was kind of attached or obsessed with Michelle. So, Williams was also a Navy sailor and he lived in the apartment across the hall with his wife, Nicole. He and Nicole were also recently married as well, and they shared the apartment with another sailor. His name was Joseph Dick Jr. They were both stationed on the USS Saipan, a light aircraft carrier. So, of course, they're going to want to bring Daniel in for questioning. Now, I think that's pretty consistent with what should happen. Where this story branches is that he was interrogated for 8 hours straight, having begun at 5 a.m. Within the next hour, he confessed to Ford. He was treated like a criminal. He was threatened, and eventually he broke down and confessed. During his interview, he had told Detective Ford that he was on duty on the USS Saipan at the time the murder occurred. Neither the supervising officers said that they were ever interviewed by the Norfolk police or his defense counsel. And in addition, no records were requested from the ship either. Ship logs show who was on duty at all times. And so, if his initial alibi was that he was working on a ship during the time of the murder, and they don't go question that, the assistant Commonwealth's attorney made the claim that he wasn't on the ship, even though it could have been proven or disproven, but the state didn't have to prove it, nor did they have to disprove his alibi, because, well, guess what? They obtained a confession. Because that is the power of a confession. Now, waiting for his trial, he roomed with a jailhouse informant who stated there was another person who should be investigated, and it was Eric Wilson, another sailor. Once they had Eric, they went back to Williams to see if there was anyone else. They're at 2. Let's go for more, right? Why not? Williams said that a dude named George was there, but he pointed to Derek Tice from his photograph. All in all, 4 men were identified, in air quotes. 3 of them active duty and 1 retired. Nobody, not one of these guys, had a prior record. Derek Tice was arrested in Florida where he was living. Detective Ford traveled down there to arrest him, and he was interrogated for 11 hours. At the end, he confessed to the crime as well. In addition, he named 2 further Navy men, John Paulette and Jeffrey A. Ferris. Now, in return, John and Jeffrey were arrested for rape and capital murder. The difference with these 2 sailors is that they did not confess. Jeffrey Ferris asked for a lawyer, which in turn stopped his interrogation. John Pauley was actually cleared, as he was confirmed being hundreds of miles away at the time of the murder. They had work records and bank records, and I'm surprised they looked into them because they sure didn't look into anyone else's. Perhaps these ones were just too obvious to miss. I want so badly to get into the DNA right now, but the claims and additions of other suspects aren't over. And to that I say, good grief, Charlie Brown. Now, again, in October of 1998, over a year after the murder, they interrogated Tice, who then named John E. Dander as a 7th individual. 7th. Of course, John didn't confess either, primarily because he didn't do it, as he was living states away in Pennsylvania. But that apparently isn't enough. Despite having a few documents stating where he was still indicted for rape and capital murder. So, what about the DNA, you say? Of course, this was the late 90s, and while DNA wasn't uncommon, it certainly wasn't as expeditious as it, well, still isn't now. Is now? I guess it depends on who you are and what the case is. When Daniel Williams was arrested, DNA was taken. This was in early 97. It wasn't until December 97 that police learned Williams' DNA wasn't a match. As if that wasn't bad enough, it wasn't until April 1998 in which they told his attorney his DNA wasn't a match. I'll give you a second. Let's pick our jaws back up off the floor. Because that's, well, it's quite a we know something you don't know. Nyeh, 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 nyeh. And if you think that timeline is effed, in January of 98, 3 months before the defense attorney was told about the DNA, they offered Williams a plea agreement in which he would plead guilty for a life sentence and not death. They knew his DNA didn't match. A couple months later, they offered him a plea agreement 3 months before they told his attorney that his DNA didn't match. Williams, thankfully, refused it. And it was at that time the police, well, they didn't know where to go. So they simply arrested Williams' roommate, Joe Dick. So, March of 1998, Dick's DNA was excluded as well. When Dick named Eric Wilson as a co-conspirator, his DNA was also excluded from the evidence at the scene. Tice's DNA was excluded as well. In February 1999, almost 2 years after the murder, another DNA test was available, and that excluded all 7 men from the DNA at the crime scene. The last 3 men named, John Dander, John Pauley, and Jeffrey Fari, had their charges dropped. But that didn't stop them from being in jail for a period of time, though. Now, despite all of the DNA not matching, Detective Ford and prosecutor Damian Hansen kept acting as if the other 4 were part of a, quote, multiple offender attack. Now, I cannot even begin to express my displeasure at this. So, what happened? What happened in 99 and 2000 while the real Slim Shady was on the radio? Well, this is what happened. The trials continued. But of course, the story doesn't end there. So let's Tarantino this crap and let's go back to summer of 97. And let's talk a little bit about Omar Ballard. Omar Abdul Ballard enters this story summer of 97, and this is around the same time he met both Bill and Michelle Bosco. Now, June 27th, 1997, Omar, if he hadn't already proven himself to be a massive pile of cow turds when he beat a woman, Melissa Morse, with a bat at the same apartment complex that the Boscos lived at. His friend lived in an apartment there, and her name was Tamika Taylor. The woman who lived next to the Boscos, who pointed out Daniel Williams as a, quote, weirdo, and which led to him being arrested, interrogated, and creating an avalanche of poor form on the Norfolk Police Department's part. Breathe. So while the heat was on, Tamika took Omar over to the couple's apartment. So Omar had beaten Melissa Morse with a bat. The heat was on him. He went to Tamika Taylor. Tamika then took Omar to the Bosco's apartment. Now, you'd think this would spike some concern, but William Bosco allowed him to stay there and actively turned men away who were looking for him. That's kind of a hashtag not cool, bro. I think the kids do this for hashtags now. I don't know. But we're going to get back to his involvement with the Boscos. 10 days after the rape and murder of Michelle, he beat and raped a 14-year-old girl a mile away from the apartments. For that crime, he was apprehended. Now, this was January 1998, and he pleaded guilty. A little later, he was charged with the other brutal attack, and he was put away for 41 years in prison. Of course, for whatever reason, Omar found it important to brag to someone from prison in February of 99. He decided he would threaten someone by writing a letter and how he, so here's the deal. He wanted to threaten somebody that was outside the prison, decided to write a letter, and he chose this way to make her scared. He claimed in the letter to have murdered Michelle Moore-Bosko. Now, that's a turn of events. Now, this is February of 99, and around this time, when the 7 men, all 7 of them were excluded due to the DNA tests, this letter was done. And at what point they had this letter versus the DNA, I don't really know. What I do know is this. Tamika Taylor, the person who Omar sheltered with for a bit, said that she told Norfolk police pretty quickly about the murder in question and that they should investigate Omar as a person of interest. That would have been in 97. It wasn't until February 99 that they decided to look into it. Police had received a copy around that time. When questioned, Omar confessed twice to the police in March and April of 99. Not only that, but papers were sent to the court, including the confession. Not only that, but I happened to find his affidavit with the confession. Line 2. I acted alone when I killed Michelle Moore-Bosko. None of the other individuals who were charged with raping or killing Michelle were there or involved in any way. They are all innocent, and the ones who are in prison are serving long sentences for crimes that they did not commit. Line 8. After I had sex with her and killed her, I left Michelle's house in the early morning hours of July 8th, 1997, and went to Tamika's house where I slept on the couch. The police questioned Tamika that day, but they did not ask me any questions. Line 9. In fact, the police did not question me about Michelle's murder until 1999. Line 10. Ford said, Detective Ford, just give us 5 minutes. He then showed me pictures of the other defendants and asked if I knew them. I told him that I did not know the other defendants. Line 11. On or about March 4th, 1999, Detective Ford and another detective returned with a warrant. Ford asked me a series of leading questions in an attempt to get the version of the crime that he wanted. For example, Ford would tell me some detail about the killing of Michelle and then ask me a question, encouraging me to use the detail he had just provided in my answer. I repeatedly told Ford that I committed the crime alone, but Ford wanted me to say that the other defendants had been involved. Line 12. On March 11th, 1999, Detective Ford and another detective visited me again. I gave them a second written statement. In that statement, I remained truthful in saying I committed the crime alone. Line 13. In addition to the two written statements on March 4th and 11th, 1999, I repeatedly told Detective Ford and his partners that I killed Michelle alone. Line 14. Although I continued to tell the detectives and prosecutors that I committed the crime alone, nobody would believe me. As part of the plea agreement, I signed a very short statement describing the crime based on what Detective Ford implied had occurred. That statement is totally false. Line 15. At the second trial of Derek Tice, I was going to testify truthfully and tell the jury that I committed the crime alone. Unfortunately, nobody wanted to hear the truth. Line 16. About a month before I was transferred to the holding cell in Alexandria to testify at Tice's second trial, Ford and another detective visited me at the prison. At the time, I was planning to testify truthfully that I committed the crime alone. Ford made clear through his statements and actions that he wanted me to testify that I had nothing to say. He knew that if I testified, I would tell the truth that I committed the crime alone. Ford did not want me to tell the truth that Tice was not involved in Michelle's murder. Now, he also said that his lawyer came in to tell him to say he had nothing to say, as did one of the prosecutors. He ended up saying that he had nothing to say because of the pressure. That's a lot of people in some high level positions telling you not to say anything. So, he on top of that stated that he has no knowledge of the other folks who were condemned to prison. In early March of 99, he was interviewed by Ford and Peterson. A week later, he was interviewed again and gave in the full details. Despite this, the convictions and false confessions were allowed to stand as primary evidence in the trials. I swear I'm almost done, but it just gets worse. A year later, notes surfaced from Detective Ford from an interview with Omar Ballard, March 15th, 2000. Now, I'm not exactly sure about all of this, but this is a smidgen of the lies that Ford wrote. During this interview, Ballard stated that he met Daniel Williams, Joe Dick, Eric Wilson, and Derek Tice in the parking lot. Ballard stated that he had been told not to come on the property, but he had family there, so he had to come see them. Ballard further stated that he knew Daniel Williams from Bosko's apartment. The 4 white males told him that they had tried to get Michelle to open the door and let them in, but she had refused. Ballard stated that he walked up and knocked on Bosko's door, and the 4 males stood to the side. When she opened the door, they all rushed in. I'm going to leave the rest of the notes out of this, but I haven't heard about any of this from anybody. Not the interview, not this account, nothing. Now, does it mean it didn't happen? Not necessarily, but what is absolutely clear is that Omar did this. He confessed repeatedly. The story remained the same years after. Despite that, 4 guys were put in prison for a very long time, based solely on their false confessions after being destroyed in an interrogation room, mentally and otherwise. So what's the aftermath? Williams and Dick pleaded guilty to rape and capital murder and agreed to the following. They were not tried by a jury. They were sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Dick said he would testify as a state's witness against the 2 other guys. Wilson was acquitted of murder, but found guilty of rape. He recanted his confession and said it was due to the intense interrogation tactics. Wilson and Tice, despite their attorneys saying that the DNA excluded them, frustrating. Despite their attorneys saying that the DNA excluded them, the prosecutor said in return that the, quote, lack of DNA evidence did not mean that these defendants were not at the scene. Despite defense saying Ballard confessed to being the only one, the prosecution said that it was a group attack. Wilson was sentenced to 8.5 years. Tice was found guilty of rape and capital murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. Dick testified against him, but the only evidence prosecution had was Wilson's signed confession, which he recanted. Ballard pleaded guilty in March 2000 and said he incriminated the Norfolk Four in order to receive a sentence of 2 life terms rather than the death penalty he was threatened with. Prosecutor Damian Hansen moved to the City of Chesapeake Commonwealth Attorney's Office, and he continued to prosecute the Norfolk Four throughout their time in the justice system. He eventually became deputy attorney, because of course he did. All we really need to know is that every avenue the Four took failed. In 2004, the Innocence Project took up their case. Tice's second conviction was overturned in 2006. This was a Virginia Circuit Court that did it. Then the state appealed to the Virginia Supreme Court, which then reinstated the conviction. They let him out. They pulled him back. There was a petition for habeas corpus filed, and the circuit court's decision to vacate charges and convictions was upheld, and he was freed in 2011, 14 years later. Around May 2010, the infamous detective Robert Ford was indicted in Virginia on unrelated federal extortion charges. He accepted money from criminal suspects in return for favorable treatment. Of course, defense attorneys said, "Hey, wait a minute," and they called for their client's charges to be vacated. The convictions of Williams and Dick were vacated, and they were exonerated in October of 2016. For those of you playing the home game and doing the math, that's 19 years later. U.S. District Judge John Gibney said, quote, "By any measure, the evidence showed that Daniel Williams and Joseph J. Dick did not commit the rape and murder to which they each pleaded guilty, and no sane human being could convict them with the available evidence." Ultimately, it wasn't until March 21st, 2017, in which the Virginia governor gave all 4 absolute pardons. Eventually, the Norfolk Four filed a suit against the city. The city of Norfolk paid them $4.9 million, and the state added another $3.5 million to that. So, 20 years in jail for something that you didn't do, $8.4 million total. That's $2.1 million per person. That's $105,000 per year. They were falsely convicted and kept in jail. Well, I'd say that that's not enough at all. What kills me is that it wasn't until November 2016 that the Virginia Attorney General instructed the Norfolk police to videotape all interrogations and confessions in cases involving homicides. With Defective Ford. Ooh, Freudian slip. With Detective Ford at the wheel for so long, I'd be fascinated to know just how many people were coerced into false confessions with him. So, final thoughts. Confessions are given much too much clout. Now, I'm not saying they should not be considered. Of course, confessions are great when they're given of someone's own free will and without coercement. They're great when they're given without conflict or issue. However, I think that two things need to happen. One, we need to reconsider how we play this interrogation game. Maybe we need to consider the peace method I mentioned before. And two, until that point, we need to give far less credence to confessions and more weight to the evidence. Now, that's not a perfect solution. Of course, it's not. And you can come up with a million reasons why that might not work. But here we are, and there they were. And that's the story of the Norfolk Four and false confessions. Y'all, this has been a great first episode of 13th Juror Sidebar. I appreciate y'all being with us. We are going to be doing these every other week when WTF is not airing on Sunday nights. And we will see you on Monday for day court, followed by night court. Thank you all for hanging in there, and we'll see you next time. Don't forget to smile.